They stole my parking spot, thinking I'd just accept it. But I dug deep, exposed their scheme, and now the entire HOA board has resigned. Alex Brooks had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years. He chose this home not just for its convenient location, but also because it had everything he needed, including his own designated parking spot. It seemed like a small thing, but in reality, it was crucial. In a neighborhood where every street filled with cars by evening, having a reserved spot meant avoiding daily stress. But that day, everything changed. After a long day at work, Alex turned onto his street as usual and headed toward his parking space. But something was off. His spot was taken by someone else's car. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. Maybe someone had parked there temporarily. It happened. But as he walked closer, he saw a man in a business suit checking his car's trunk, completely unbothered by the fact that he was in someone else's spot. Alex stopped, glanced at the markings on the pavement, and double-checked. No mistake. This was his space. When he confronted the man, he got an unexpected response. The spot no longer belonged to him. The HOA had reallocated parking spaces, and Alex no longer had the right to park there. He couldn't believe it. His parking spot had belonged to him since he bought the house. He had paperwork to prove it. In 5 years, there had never been a question about ownership. And now, they were simply telling him it wasn't his anymore. He went straight to the HOA office for an explanation. The association's manager, Julia Martin, greeted him with her usual cold, rehearsed politeness. Her tone was flat, as if she were reading from a script. Alex learned that after an internal audit, the HOA had determined that his spot was not officially assigned, which meant they had the right to reallocate it. A new owner had paid an administrative fee, and the space now belonged to them. This was absurd. He presented copies of his documents, but Julia simply shrugged. The HOA's system showed different information, and if he wanted to reclaim a parking spot, he'd have to submit a new request and pay a fee. A wave of frustration hit him. This wasn't just a clerical error. This was a scheme. The HOA had taken his spot and sold it to someone else, assuming he wouldn't fight back. But they had picked the wrong guy. As Alex walked out of the office, he knew. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the beginning of a war. Alex wasn't about to let this go. As soon as he got home, he pulled out all his paperwork, his original purchase contract, the property map, and a letter from the developer clearly stating that the parking spot was part of his home. The next day, he marched back into the HOA office, ready for a fight. Julia Martin greeted him with the same forced courtesy. This time, Alex laid his documents on her desk and demanded they reverse the reallocation immediately. She studied the papers, hesitated for a moment, then gave him a fake smile. The HOA would conduct an additional review, she said, but the space had already been legally transferred. If he wanted a new one, he could apply, for a fee. Alex clenched his fists. This wasn't an accident. They weren't even trying to hide the fact that they had trapped him in a bureaucratic scam. Days later, he received his first official notice from the HOA. According to the letter, a recent inspection of his property had resulted in a fine for violating exterior appearance regulations. He read it twice. An $800 fine for an improperly colored gate. His gate had been the same color since the day he moved in. The next day, another letter arrived. This time, he was fined for overgrown bushes encroaching on the property line. Then another. His trash bin was supposedly in the wrong location. Within a week, the HOA had buried him in fines, totaling nearly $5,000. Alex knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to pressure him, either to comply or to sell his home and leave. He started noticing things. Someone was watching his house. One morning, he stepped outside and saw a man with a clipboard jotting things down as he surveyed his property. An HOA inspector, looking for more violations. Neighbors he'd known for years now avoided him. Some were afraid of getting involved, but others sympathized. One evening, an elderly neighbor named Gary approached him. He had lived there for nearly 15 years and knew exactly how the HOA operated. "They've done this before," he said quietly, glancing around. "I've seen it happen. First, they take small things, parking spots, minor property adjustments. Then they start hitting you with fines. People either pay up or sell their homes just to escape." Alex listened, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about his parking spot. The HOA was trying to push him out, but he wasn't going anywhere. If they thought they could intimidate him with fines and threats, they were dead wrong. Alex no longer had any doubts. HOA was trying to push him out. First, they stole his parking spot. Then, they buried him in fines, hoping he'd either give up and pay or sell his home and leave. But he wasn't the type to back down easily. He began gathering evidence. The first thing he did was comb through the HOA bylaws, which he had kept since purchasing his home. As he read carefully, he discovered several crucial details. First, no parking spots could be reassigned without the written consent of the owner. That meant his spot had been taken illegally. Second, according to the section on fines, homeowners were supposed to receive an official warning and a reasonable time to correct any violations before being penalized. Yet, he had been issued fines immediately, without any prior notice. But the most important discovery was that the HOA was required to publish annual financial reports detailing their expenses, fines, and a list of assigned parking spots. That last part gave Alex an idea. If he could access those records, he might uncover a pattern, proof that the HOA had been systematically stealing property from residents. He started talking to his neighbors. Most were too scared to say much, but a few admitted they had been through the same thing. One man, Dan, revealed that a couple of years ago, his parking spot had suddenly been reassigned to a new homeowner. When Dan protested, the HOA buried him in fines, just like they were doing to Alex. In the end, he gave up, sold his house, and moved away. It was a repeating pattern. The HOA had been doing this for years, seizing property, forcing people out, and profiting from it. Alex needed to get his hands on the financial reports. By law, these reports were supposed to be accessible to residents, but when he checked the HOA's website, there was nothing. So he sent an official request, demanding reports from the past 5 years. A few days later, the HOA responded, denying his request. They claimed that the reports were internal and confidential. That was all the confirmation Alex needed. They were hiding something. So, he decided to dig deeper. He found a public records archive where real estate transactions in the area were documented. After hours of searching, he found exactly what he was looking for. Over the past 3 years, the HOA had reassigned multiple parking spots and sold them to new homeowners for hefty fees. The same names kept popping up as buyers. One of them? Mark Walton, the HOA treasurer. As Alex investigated further, he found a clear pattern. The same group of people kept acquiring reassigned parking spots, only to resell them privately later, making thousands of dollars in profit. It was an organized scheme. HOA was abusing its power to illegally seize property, then sell it to insiders who would later flip it for a profit. This wasn't just corruption. It was fraud. Now, Alex didn't just have suspicions. He had proof. But confronting the HOA wasn't enough. He needed to hit them where it hurt. He needed an army. Alex knew he couldn't fight this alone. The HOA had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist for years. Residents were afraid to challenge them. But now, he had evidence. Financial reports, real estate transactions, witness testimonies. All he had to do was convince the others to fight back. Step 1. Exposing the truth. Alex printed flyers detailing the HOA's scheme, how they had been illegally redistributing parking spaces, burying homeowners in fines, and forcing them to sell their homes. He slipped them into mailboxes. He posted them on bulletin boards. The response was immediate. People started reaching out, telling their own stories. Some were still too scared to speak publicly, but others were ready to fight. Over the past few years, the HOA had done this to dozens of residents. Most either paid the fines or left. Not this time. Step 2. Organizing the residents. Alex called for a neighborhood meeting at Gary's house, the same neighbor who had warned him about the HOA's shady tactics. 20 people showed up. Almost everyone in the room had their own horror story about the HOA, made-up violations, unreasonable fines, or property taken from them. Alex laid out the evidence. He showed them transaction records, misappropriated funds, and proof of insider deals. The room filled with outrage. For the first time, residents were no longer afraid. They were ready to take action. Step 3. Taking the HOA to court. The very next day, the group filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA. Alex had contacted Lisa Harper, a local attorney with experience in real estate fraud. The moment she reviewed the documents, she knew this case was bigger than parking spots. This was a massive corruption scandal. Step 4. Going public. At the same time, Alex leaked the story to the press. A week later, the local newspaper published a front-page article. Homeowners Association corruption exposed. Residents lose property in rigged deals. The article detailed everything: the fraudulent reassignment of parking spaces, the fines used as intimidation tactics, and the financial corruption within the HOA. It was the beginning of the end. The next day, all hell broke loose. The HOA office was bombarded with calls and complaints. Social media exploded with discussions about the scandal. Local authorities launched an investigation into the HOA's finances. Desperate, the HOA tried to fight back. The very next morning, Alex received a new fine, this time for spreading false information and violating community rules by organizing an unauthorized meeting. But it was too late. The residents were done being afraid. That same afternoon, dozens of neighbors gathered outside the HOA office, holding signs and demanding resignations. For the first time in years, the HOA was powerless. The real fight was yet to come. The lawsuit went to trial, and with the overwhelming evidence Alex had gathered, the HOA board was cornered. Financial records proved embezzlement. Testimonies confirmed fraudulent property seizures. Multiple insider deals were exposed. Faced with criminal charges, members of the HOA board, including Mark Walton, resigned. But for Alex and his neighbors, this wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about taking back their community. And they did. Final verdict? The HOA's corruption was shattered. The court ruled in favor of the residents, ordering the return of all stolen parking spots, refunding fraudulent fines, and dissolving the existing HOA leadership. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free, and it all started with one stolen parking spot. The trial began a few weeks later, but the effects of the lawsuit and the explosive newspaper article were felt immediately. For years, residents had remained silent, but now they were speaking out. The media covered new developments daily, and local authorities launched an official investigation into the HOA's practices. The HOA board tried to do what they had always done: deny everything and intimidate the residents. They issued a public statement calling the accusations baseless attacks and the lawsuit an attempt to discredit an organization dedicated to maintaining order and harmony in the community. But this time, no one believed them. By the time the trial date arrived, the courtroom was packed. Among the attendees were not only the plaintiffs but dozens of other residents, all eager to witness the downfall of the system that had held them in fear for years. The judge opened the case by addressing the key issue. Did the HOA have the legal authority to reassign parking spaces without the owner's consent? Alex and his attorney, Lisa Harper, presented hard evidence, documents proving that his parking spot was legally included in the purchase of his home. Other plaintiffs provided similar paperwork, proving that their spots had been stolen under the same pretense. The HOA's defense was weak. They claimed that their internal database had been accidentally updated, leading to the unintentional reassignment of parking spots. No one believed them. And that was just the first blow. Lisa Harper then presented financial records exposing years of fraudulent transactions. The judge examined the statements closely and noticed a pattern. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into the personal accounts of HOA board members under the label of administrative fees. Then came the final bombshell, proof of the parking lot resale scheme. Lisa presented real estate transactions showing that multiple parking spots had been reassigned to HOA board members. These board members then sold them at market price to third-party buyers. The buyers had direct connections to the HOA treasurer, Mark Walton. The courtroom fell silent. The judge turned to the HOA representatives. "Can you explain these discrepancies?" They had no answer. The court's ruling was swift and severe. All reassigned parking spots must be returned to their rightful owners. All fraudulent fines from the past 3 years must be voided. The HOA must compensate homeowners for unjust fees and penalties. All misappropriated funds must be returned. But it didn't stop there. Following the trial, authorities launched a criminal investigation into the HOA's finances. What they found was even worse than expected. The HOA had been embezzling funds for years. Board members had personally profited from illegal property transfers. Mark Walton and Julia Martin were charged with fraud, abuse of power, and property misappropriation. As the investigation unfolded, the entire HOA board collapsed. Within months, several board members resigned and left the neighborhood in disgrace. Those involved in fraud faced criminal charges. The HOA was officially dissolved. In its place, the residents formed a new homeowners association, one where every homeowner had a voice. Alex parked in his rightful spot once again, knowing that justice had prevailed. The HOA had once believed they could steal from homeowners and rule through fear. But in the end, they were the ones who lost everything.